brief introduction. I love that sound. Thank you, Rob. I'm going to very, very briefly talk about just a couple of key issues around divestment. And everyone's been sent the briefing. You'll all be sent the briefing again afterwards. I don't really want to spend too much time on this because what we're actually really here to listen is the next 3 bits is Mark, who's going to talk about the financial case for divestment. Mark is a world expert on this. He comes from Carbon Tracker, and they've had huge influence around the world on the kind of financial arguments against fossil fuels, and he'll go into much more detail. And then we were really, really luckily enjoyed by Councillor Roger Evans from Shropshire Council, and about how the work that the Lib Dems have done to lead on divestment there and bringing divestment to a vote. We're going to try and keep, I'll be very short. Mark will go into a bit more detail because it is very detailed. And then Roger will kind of give a case study. And then what we're kind of really here for is the questions and answers session, because I'm sure as all you know, like there's quite the specific questions relate to each different area very differently and how they come up. It can be quite complicated. So I'd really, really encourage everyone throughout the session throughout the 3 presentations to write down questions. Anything you think that comes up across the 3 presentations, just write it down and we'll have plenty of time to get into the detail at the end. Now here's the really, really quick overview of fossil fuel investments. So across the UK, there's 10 billion invested. The average for the fund is 3%, which is about average for many pension funds. And these are investments in all the companies you've heard of before. You know, the biggest would be Shell and BP, but then there's also Glencore, Exxon, Chevron, and then a host of tiny ones. I'd just like to do one final plug for the briefing that we wrote with the ALDC, which is, you can see in the image here on the right. It's about 12 pages, goes through everything bit by bit, and also links to a report we did in March where we worked out the investments in fossil fuels that each council in the UK has. And that's much more detailed and goes into much more. But it's all there. I think at the start, some of this can seem quite daunting, very complicated, but I would really encourage you just to look through that briefing that we did. We've worked with councillors on it before to try and make it as clear as possible. And then the thing is, like, we are always open to talk to you about this. We can guide you through. We've worked with individual councillors and individual areas or groups of councillors together, and we're happy to support you because each situation is different, and we do try and be mindful of that. Something I think that's really useful to talk about when I try to talk about why divestment is important. Mark will look a lot more at the financial case, but I think it's good to just know that the public want this to happen, and as elected representatives, if you're interested in it and they're interested in it, there's no reason to not do it. YouGov research in March 2021 found that just 12% of the British public supported the investment of local government pension funds in fossil fuel companies, whereas 65% of voters supported the investments of pension funds into renewable energy projects, and only 5% opposed the suggestion. The findings are like pretty consistent across parties, but actually reinvestment is more popular with Lib Dems and any other party. These are based on 2019 voters. I think I also quite like to point out that, not only is this good with your members, but also there's elections coming up. If you want to try and attract other voters, it's not just, popular with Lib Dems or one party, it's actually kind of consistently popular, both in terms of kind of by almost demographic and by age and by region as well. I think on the reinvestment side, it's also really interesting to point out that Ed Davey has also commissioned research that revealed that the growth of renewable power in the UK has collapsed to its lowest rate in a decade, and has called on the government to drastically increase renewable capacity to 80% of all electricity by 2030. And when we kind of take this in the context of divestment, if you have, say, 3% of your fund invested in fossil fuels, that's money that like very easily can help kind of power the switch to renewables. They can be both, local, UK-wide, or even abroad. It's all really well set up to kind of tackle many issues at once. And I think that's kind of often a really good argument that you can make with other councillors when you're talking to each other about this. And then there's one issue that I really want to talk about that isn't actually covered in the briefing, just because we didn't have that much space. We talk about engagement. And engagement is this kind of the idea that, you know, this is the argument that you'll come up against the most. And Mark will talk about this briefly as well, but engagement is we should keep the shares we have in these companies in order to put pressure on them to do better, because they'll like listen to us, and we can encourage them to move away from fossil fuels and to become renewable companies. And something that I find is both quite like impactful, both in motivating yourself to do it, but really good when you're talking to other councillors that say you're in favour of divestment. And I'm sure not everyone here is, and we can go into that at the end. But if you yourself are in favour of divestment, or at least you're kind of open to the idea, and you'll talk to another councillor that says, oh, actually, you know, I consider that myself, but then we thought we should keep our shares in these companies in order to encourage them to do better. I think I can see in theory in some ways how that might make sense. If you don't, you know, go into too much of the detail of this, it has possibly, you know, it could have some influence on your thinking. But if you actually look at the work, what engagement actually amounts to for the local government pension scheme, the detail really, really matters. So the local authority pension fund forum, it's a body that exists to promote the highest standard of corporate governance and to protect the long-term value of all local authority pension funds. I think 86 of the 99 LGVS funds are members. And actually every year their annual report summarizes the shareholder engagements that they undertake. Now you can see them here. The majority of these are on climate change, but they also deal with things like human rights questions and governance issues. But this is actually taken from their 2020 report. It's the most recent one that's available. And you can see here what form their engagement takes. So when they say, well, we carry out loads of engagement, we engage with companies, we talk to them, we want to get them to change to be better. You can see here that, you know, it really is just correspondence. And this is the activity. And this is again from their own report. And I'll show you the next slide, again, taken from their report, that shows what are the outcomes of this engagement. What does this actually, so this is what it looks like. And then this is what they say when it's the results it has. The contrast between the tiny number of satisfactory responses and the vast majority being nothing other than, well, like, you know, talking about it or being ignored is quite clearly disappointing. I think for shareholder engagement to have an effect on fossil fuel majors, it must take the shape of an actual resolution passed in AGM, not just correspondence or dialogue, as is so prevalent there. The local authority pension fund forum say divesting reduces leverage with companies and makes it hard to influence positive change. But like, this could be theoretically true, but it's only really valid if you use the power you have for meaningful action. They might point to the positive influence they've had on BP setting a target of net zero by 2050. But BP's net zero 2050 plan still relies on producing 1.5 million barrels of oil a day. And I don't think they're going to stop doing this because a representative from the local authority pension fund forum sent them a letter or attended them a meeting. They have to vote at AGMs where it matters. And those votes have to have the outcome of ending fossil fuel output. And then I think sometimes when I talk to councillors about this, they say like, oh, but you know, like as a pension fund, we really believe in engagement, and it's kind of something we kind of see as our duty to do. And I think that's really, really fair. I think engagement on many issues is very, very admirable, just not with fossil fuel companies. Also in the report, they talk about the kind of positive effect they had on pressuring companies like Tesco to reduce deforestation and just the use of plastics in their goods. And I think that's really admirable, and that's the kind of work that we should continue pension funds to be doing, because they can have an outcome. You know, Tesco's fundamental business model doesn't really matter about how much plastic their goods come wrapped in, whereas BP's relies on producing oil. That's what their assets are in. I'm sure Mark will go into a bit more detail on that. But just, yeah, I think sometimes when we talk about engagement, the two misconceptions are it works, and it clearly isn't at a GPS level. And then the second thing is, oh, we shouldn't just stop all our engagement, but it's just by picking strategically what you can have success in, I think. And with that in mind, I think, you know, I just want to point to the fact that there's loads of support available to you. On the right there's an image from the ALDC's website, which is an updated council motion on pension fund divestment from fossil fuels. On the left is a template petition you can use. There's also, they have resources available on making a letter for your area. And we've been trying to work with political parties around divestment before. You kind of get individual interest, but it's really great to have the support of the LDC. And I think it's kind of part of this like growing momentum around the world, but particularly now in the UK as well, about divestment. I think, you know, we had COP really recently, and there's kind of renewed focus around that. And thanks to the work of people like Mark and, you know, local councillors that have led on this, there really is an interest. I think in the UK, 90 universities and 80 faith institutions have committed to divesting from fossil fuels. The Welsh Parliament has, the Northern Irish Assembly has, and in the last Parliament, 360 MPs from across the political spectrum called on their pension fund to divest. I think every Lib Dem MP signed up in the last Parliament, and there's a renewed movement to get current MPs to sign up again and push for it again. I think it's globally 1,485 institutions have divested, with a total asset value, or they've divested a total of £39 trillion, which is kind of the equivalent of like the economies of the US and China combined. So it's really a serious amount of money. The momentum is really building. On a local government level, it began in 2016 in the London Borough of Waltham Forest, and they're followed by Southwark, Cardiff, Islington and Lambeth. And then there's just even in the last couple of months, there's been loads of announcements. Oxford has decided to divest 15% of their fund. Neom is moving £500 million away to a fossil-free fund. And really recently, Luton just started to divest, which is part of the Bedford Pension Fund. In Luton, it was put forward by Labour, but backed by Lib Dems. And that kind of now puts pressure on the Bedford Pension Fund, who is the administering authority. And there really is, you know, momentum behind this. And I think it's kind of coming from a realization that lots of people see divestment as the next step for ambitious climate action at a local level. I think 75% of councils have declared a climate emergency. There's a lot of work that goes into, you know, kind of EV charging points and recycling. And I think a lot of councils have taken that on now, and now they're kind of looking at like, what's the next thing? And in some ways, you know, with the right support, it can be quite low hanging fruit. You just have to pass a motion to get this. So I'm going to kind of keep this wrap up for now, but we just encourage everyone to write down the questions. And I think the thing to think about maybe for the next two presentations and the question and answer session is, you know, what can you as a councillor do about this? I mean, if you're on the pension fund, you can vote on it and speak in favour of the next pension fund committee meeting. If you're just a councillor that's not in the fund, you can talk to your fellow councillors, those that are on the pension fund, you know, in your own party, but also across parties. There's lots of examples of, you know, cross-party work on this. And I think in some ways it's a really positive thing that it's not just seen as kind of a party political thing where you only talk to your own about it, but actually you can work with your colleagues for something that's good, both kind of with an international, you know, have a huge kind of effect globally, and also at a local level on securing your pension, and then looking at the reinvestment that you can do. And to any kind of council staff that are here with us, like particularly like climate officers, as I know there's a few on the call, talk to councillors, get them engaged on it, particularly those in the pension fund. And we will be in touch with you after this. I'll be sending out the briefing again and the report that I mentioned that we did in March. And we can offer really specific advice for your tailored to your needs. And I'll just leave that there now. So thank you very much. And I'll now pass over to Mark to share his screen. And yeah, thank you. Mark, whenever you're ready.
Thanks for that, Ben. And hopefully, I'm just pressing the start on my timer. So there'll be a buzz going off in my room just to remind me to wind up. So we built over the last 200 years of industrialization a fossil fuel-based economy. It's everywhere we look. It's through all our lives. It's through the way we manufacture, the way we move about, the power systems. It's a fossil fuel-based economy. And yet, if we're to do anything about the challenges of of climate change and staying to well below 2 degrees, we're going to have to turn that pretty much upside down over the next decade. And just to remind you what was discussed up at Glasgow, I spent a couple of weeks up there as part of those discussions, is we're going to have to cut emissions globally by 50% over the next decade. That means completely turning over the global economy if we're to have any chance of stabilizing warming. So this has consequences. It has consequences for the fossil fuel system, and that's what I'm going to look into. But the hope is, and I'm not the first to say this, but I think it's well worth reminding ourselves that we'll be the first generation in human history to be able to heat ourselves, cook, and transport ourselves and power ourselves without actually ever having to burn anything. So imagine back with the Neanderthals in the caves, heating and cooking with wood, and we move through industrialization where we use coal and then obviously oil and gas. We'll be the first generation in human history where we don't actually need to burn a thing to do any of those things before, because we've got all the answers with electrification, with electrons primarily, and we're in the middle of an extraordinary clean energy shift driven by technology that has consequences for investors. So what I'm going to talk about over the next 20 minutes or so is a little bit of a background around carbon budgets. How much CO2 can we release to the atmosphere before we're really seriously in trouble? How big is the size of the fossil fuel system that we have to decarbonize from a financial perspective? Then what are the companies doing? The companies that we typically own in our pension funds, and if we're fiduciaries, what we ought to be doing about that. And then how quickly do markets react to technology change? And does that tell us anything about what we need to do as investors? So now, okay, so Carbon Trade, if you've not come across this before, we're a non-profit financial think tank. I set it up about 10 years ago. The previous 20 years I spent working for large asset management companies, Jupiter Asset Management, Henderson Global Investors, and AMP Capital, which included running local authority pension fund money. So my team, we were running money for Notts and for Lancashire, and prior to that for Somerset. So it's an area that I'm pretty familiar with. And in the non-profit, what I decided to do was hire a lot of people out of Wall Street in the City of London whose roles were, I've got the old head of oil and gas for HSBC Bank. I did that for 20 years, the old head of research for Citigroup, and also another one for Deutsche Bank. So people experienced in finance. So across the Tracker Group, I've got about 70 staff, and each year I spend about $10 million. That covers my office in New York and Texas, close to the oil industry. And all the research we provide is obviously for free. We don't have services or anything else like that, but we're very close to the largest investment management companies, and we regularly present to the world's top 5 investment managers, many of whom will probably be looking after money for local authorities on this call. And we also work quite closely with financial market regulators as well. So what I'm going to talk about, so I'm just going to minimize myself here if I can. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is how the science of climate change gives us a carbon budget. We need to be careful of how much we emit. There's more fossil fuels available. That's obvious. We've known that for a long time that can fit within those limits. But we're driven by a technology change that is driving us to a tipping point where suspending new investments in fossil fuel production is absolutely essential. And many institutions that we heard are divesting from fossil fuels with a financial imperative. There's no fiduciary duty to invest in bad companies or even own bad companies. So it's a mistake to believe owning fossil fuels is part of any fiduciary duty. It's not. If these are bad investments, they're bad investments, period. And that's true of any investment. And then there's a little bit of investor psychology. Investors lose money at the peak and not when the system has changed. So people are saying, well, of course, we won't need to do anything until fossil fuels are less than, say, 20% of energy supply, because there's going to be a lot of demand for fossil fuels in the future. That's to misunderstand fundamentally how financial markets work and react in practice. So what's the idea behind the carbon bubble, which is a phrase we're probably best associated with Carbon Tracker? Just a quick reminder, I think you'll know all of this. Most of the carbon dioxide that we put in the atmosphere from burning coal, oil, and gas, we put up in the last 50 years. that's such a tiny slither of time in the context of a weather system that's stabilized over tens of thousands of years. We know that we've got the highest concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere for at least the last 800,000 years. London was a steamy swamp. Last time we were at 2-3 degrees of warming, and it's not unusual for global weather systems to change. It just, you normally do it in tens of thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years. You don't do it in a slice of 50 years. So we're playing an extraordinary experiment against time to see what that would do. That has profound consequences. So how much CO2 can we put into the atmosphere? That's referred to as sort of the science of carbon budgets. A lot of this comes from the IPCC science and the analysts there. So on the top right, we emit around 41 gigatons of carbon dioxide per annum. If you were to drive a car from the Earth upwards to the outer atmosphere, it would only take, I'm told, it'd take you about 7 minutes to get into outer space from, so it's a very thin layer of the planet's surface. We're putting all of this carbon dioxide, and that's why, you know, we can see now the evidence of the real changes. The scientists estimate that there's a remaining carbon budget with a 66% probability of avoiding the worst of around 300 gigatons. If you want 2 degrees, which obviously we've not seen for tens of thousands of years, it's a little bit greater, but we go through that 1.5 degrees carbon budget in around 7 years based on current emissions, which haven't stopped at all, as we know. They're up since the Paris Agreement. That's a very, very short limited amount of time. And it doesn't mean we'll see 1.5 degrees within 7 years. We're close to it. There is always a lag factor, but 2 degrees of warming isn't that far behind. It's another 20 years. Now, as I was often told as a fund manager, there's when you're investing in a pension fund, you're investing maybe for 30 years into the future. So you're doing asset liability matching for 30 years into the future. Decisions you make as a fund manager, as a pension fund trustee, have consequences for beneficiaries in 30 years' time. So all of a sudden, looking at what the decision we make today and the investments we hold today suddenly become extraordinarily important. So you can think of this problem by looking at exchanges. And this is a map that my team put together about 10 years ago, which is what we launched with. It's changed a bit because companies come off markets and get privatized or merged, or when I meant privately owned or merged, or they get bought by others. And what you're seeing here is the cumulative carbon dioxide that sits inside the reserves of companies listed on different exchanges. So if you thought about climate change from a financial markets point of view, there's only 3 markets you think about. There's Russia with Gazprom and Rosneft and a few more. Then there's the New York Stock Exchange with your Chevrons and your Exxons. And then of course, there's the London Stock Exchange with your Glencores, your BPs and your Shells. And that's why I decided to focus on financial markets. And of course, London is a huge part of that problem. We produce less than 1% of the world's emissions. But when you think about the banking relationships and the insurance relationships and the listed companies here, we are one of the most globally significant markets in the world because London is such an important financial market. And we have been for some time for fossil fuels. And we just built our markets around mining and oil and gas. And that's our legacy really as a financial market. And as a consequence, many pension funds will have an exposure to these types of companies. So when we coined the phrase the carbon budget, I was asked to go in by Mark Carney to present to the Financial Stability Board, which was set up by the G20. This was 6 years ago, where I presented the carbon bubble stranded assets analysis to him and to all the heads of the central banks that were part of this G20 committee. And 6 weeks later, Mark Carney gave his famous speech at the Lloyd's of London insurance market, where he said the carbon budget rends the majority of reserves stranded, oil and gas and coal that will be literally unburnable, a phrase he took from the headline of our first report, Unburnable Carbon, and that this abrupt transition that we're talking about, this turning over the global economy, represents a financial stability risk. And so that's really something that's triggered financial market regulators. And then it went from really being the side of the discussion to the center of the discussion. And this was a review in the Financial Times of my first report back in 2011, and then today how the carbon bubble, this stranded assets argument drives the debate. And after that, we were asked by many banks and asset managers to join with them in writing about what this meant for their clients. And part of that was driven by sort of analysts' interest. A lot of people I knew obviously worked at my competitor firms and got in touch. But actually, this was driven a lot by the divestment movement at the time, that you had a lot of pension fund trustees writing to Schroders and Goldman Sachs and HSBC and others saying what's going on, and they got in touch, and we ended up publishing a number of these together, like the ones with S&P and HSBC that quoted Carbon Tracker, and then the debate moved on. So how big is the size of the fossil fuel system? The value of the fossil fuels themselves owned by these companies has got to be in the range of somewhere between 14 and 130 trillion dollars. It's a multiple of the price of a barrel of oil and the numbers of barrels of oil owned by companies and tons of coal. Then you've got the physical infrastructure of the system, $10 trillion of supply infrastructure, $20 trillion of demand infrastructure, and then the financial markets, the equity markets value the cement, steel, aviation, manufacturing, and auto and power companies at around 18 trillion, and then around $8 trillion of debt. So it's not insignificant. We're going to have to redesign and re-engineer pretty much all of that over the next decade, 2 decades for certain. So we think that's about 25% of the value of equity markets and around half of non-financial corporate bond markets. And so you're going to see accelerated depreciations of the fixed assets of the fossil fuel system, coal-fired power stations, oil refinery, oil pipelines, and impairments and asset write-downs. And then you've got the cleanup costs and retirement costs of the system that we've built. And the real question that people are asking today, and you've seen that with Dan Loeb's attack on Shell, to break up Shell, which you've probably been reading about in the papers the last few weeks. Can these incumbents like Shell and BP pivot their business models quickly enough? And as you'll see from that table there, we're talking about very, very steep emissions reductions. Some people are still coming to this for the first time for new. This is the Wall Street Journal just a couple of days ago who interviewed us and finally got the story into the Wall Street Journal, who's historically always resisted this. Trillions in assets may be left stranded as companies try to pivot from the risks of climate change with write-downs of power plants, auto factories, and fossil fuel reserves, which are going to cause big losses as we transition to a low-carbon future. So what does this actually all mean for companies whose strategy is based on fossil fuel demand growth? Well, here's an announcement that a lot of people miss, but is incredibly significant. It was from Fatih Birol, the head of the International Energy Agency, and when I met with him up at the COP in Glasgow, we talked together about the importance of the announcement that they made of no new investment is needed anywhere at all as of today in any new coal, oil, and gas. Historically, the International Energy Agency, which of course represents the world's biggest oil and gas producers, the Middle East and the Russians and the US and Canada, and the coal producers in Australia and Indonesia, for them to come out with this is a very, very dramatic statement of their intention to do something and the importance of the science and also the number work. And it's really how fund managers who represent and look after your assets interpret this. Does this mean some? Does this mean a little bit? No, it's pretty clear. It means no new investments needed anywhere. And what does that really mean for the companies? But let's actually look at what the companies are saying. What Shell and BP and Exxon and many of the others are saying is, we only produce what the world needs or what the world wants. And so we're kind of caught really between a rock and a hard place, because most of their modeling and the modeling from in the US from the EIA or from PIRA and the base case from BP, though I know BP's revised their scenarios, has demand growth. They've got growth in supply. Most of the oil and gas majors are planning for a huge expansion in production. And this really represents the dilemma for investors. Does this threaten the balance sheets of the companies at a time when we should be not producing more and transitioning away from the production and use of fossil fuels? And any dollar invested in new production is a dollar not invested in renewables. Oops, there we go. So there's the steep decline. The dates have been compressed a little bit there. And these emissions reductions don't just depend on ambitious policy decisions. They, of course, they also depend on how speedily the technology gets built out. And that's another, but I'm just showing that to illustrate the steep reductions in demand. So what investors want to know is which assets are at risk of being stranded. And our approach, which I'm going to show you, is quite simple, is new assets are assumed to compete on cost. And so it's the cheapest projects that fill the supply gap. So what you've got here is called a cost curve, is all the planned future oil and gas production, which is where most of the capital is going into, is in oil and gas production. And each project, to go up to the North Sea and find oil and gas, or into the Arctic, or even for oil sands, is incredibly expensive. It's not all cheap to produce, and not everybody has oil and gas like you have in the Middle East, where you just sort of push a drill down and something comes up pretty much almost instantaneously. You've got people that it costs $100, $150 to get the oil out of the ground, and that's even before they've sold it. And so you've got different marginal break-even prices. The steps is a scenario produced by the International Energy Agency, that's there in orange, and what's called the Sustainable Development scenario, also by the International Energy Agency, has a different price range. So what you've got there is an argument that says most of the planned future production of the oil and gas majors, the ones that you'll own in a pension fund, are not economically or financially viable. And this is a challenge. If you're producing at $50 or even $80 a barrel and selling at 80, you're not making money. And that's the reason why a lot of investors have fled the sector in recent years. And this is another way of illustrating the same point, is these are all those projects that I just mentioned. Here Bloomberg has named them. You can see them. You've got Kurdistan all the way down the bottom left, which is a low-cost project. Up the top right, you've got Kashagan, which BP and their partners have spent $50 billion on already, that has yet to produce any oil, that has a very high break-even price requirement. And they've intersected, this is Bloomberg's writers have intersected that with a red line saying anything above that $70 a barrel price, we're about 80 at the moment, 75, 80, is out of the money. So the reason to invest in oil and gas is to make money. What this is telling you is that their ability to make money is incredibly challenged in the future. And Carbon Tracker's analysis, you can download this off our website. 60, 70, 80, 90% of the planned investments by... is there somebody that we could put on mute, if that's possible, in the background? Thank you. But most of the capital investment planned by Chevron and Exxon and Shell is absolutely not consistent with a low warming outcome. Now, some of you saying, why does it say 1.6 degrees pathway there and not 1.5? Well, if it said 1.5, which is what I think the world has agreed we're going to settle on, those will be entirely red carbon bombs there, because no new investment is needed anywhere. I'm just showing you how it varies depending on how the warming we get varies. So we can name the projects. So when we talk about divestment, we could be divesting the company. We could be divesting companies from a stock exchange, which was a part of a Lib Dem motion that was passed at the Liberal Democrat general meeting, party conference rather, just a few months ago. Or we could get companies to divest themselves from particular projects, as in don't go ahead with projects which you may want to do. And you can see here are the projects, and we know them in detail. My team, we look at about 60,000 oil and gas projects around the world. We do the same with coal as well. So Cambo, I'm only going to mention Cambo because some of you may know about this famous. Boris is trying to decide whether we go ahead with the Cambo project in Scotland. If you want to know where that sits, it does not sit inside a 1.5 degrees scenario. It's smack bang in between those two. It's got a high break-even price. It should be at the bottom quartile. It's not. And that's one of the reasons why we don't think it should go ahead. And anyway, a lot of that oil is not for UK consumption. It will be planned for export. And so it's a high-cost producer relative to the world's lowest-cost producers. And we would argue purely on financial grounds that that's an example of a project, this time in UK waters, that's not needed. And I was up at the Scottish Energy Forum during the COP last week, where I was presenting this analysis with two Scottish oil and gas producers, offshore producers, and we went through the economic analysis that went into that in some detail. So despite this climate overhang or production overhang, can you believe it? There's a huge amount of oil and gas exploration that's planned. And as you can see on the right there, here's a list of all the companies who've announced that they're net zero. There's that statement, we're net zero, we're on a pathway to net zero, all planning a huge increase in production. Now, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not a great mathematician either, but how can you be net zero if you're planning a massive increase in production? It scientifically doesn't make sense to me, and yet many companies claim to be on a pathway to net zero. That's why people say we're engaging with success. Actually, what they're doing is allowing the companies to do more. And you've got plenty more, Chevron, Total Energies, Qatar Petroleum, that are all continuing to invest in even more exploration and production. And one of the announcements at the COP was BOGA, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, to say all countries should be giving up production rights, led by the Danes, Costa Rica, Iceland, Wales, of all people, Greenland, and a number of others. It's an important discussion we should have. So as I come to the conclusions of my presentation, I want to go into some of that financial analysis. And the important points I want to make is that peaks happen, this is in the share price and in demand, happen when new technology takes all the incremental growth for a technology. You saw this when I had a BlackBerry, in comes the iPhone, and it didn't just destroy Nokia and BlackBerry. It didn't go like iPhone goes from 5% market share to 8% to 10% to 14% and 20%, and then finally that sort of bumped off BlackBerry. iPhone went 5, 10, 20, 30, 50, 60. And before that time, BlackBerry's share price got completely knocked, as does Nokia's. And investors lose money at the peak of a demand for a product, not when the system itself has changed. And that's an important point. So this is a slide from Rystad that simply tells you that we're going to move from a system which is of power, of primary energy, of which 23% is from renewables, to much higher, 60, 70% in the future. And that's the shift we're going to make over the next 10, 20 years. And that's driven by falling costs in renewable energy technologies. So this shows you the learning curves. Every doubling in production, there's a 20% cut in price that we're seeing across all the major technologies: battery storage, offshore wind, solar modules. And I think when we talk about things like heating in the United Kingdom, ground source heat pumps, which currently cost £8,000, £9,000, £10,000 to fit into a home, in the same way that, you know, a laptop used to cost £2,000, is now £200, and large screen TVs used to be £1,500 and are now £300. Exactly the same things are happening with technologies like renewables and solar, and I also believe will happen with ground source heat pumps. And renewable technologies are much closer to the IT and computer systems than fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are not on learning curves. Every doubling in production is not reducing costs. And if you think about it, all the cheap to find oil and coal has been found. You're just left with the expensive stuff. It's inherently inflationary. As renewables get cheaper and cheaper, it's just driving out fossil fuels from the system globally. And this shows you utility scale solar in the blue line, how it's just dropped in price and is now cheaper than fossil fuels, and obviously nuclear as well, which is an expensive technology. And coal, and the time period when the cost of renewables dropped by 80%, the cost of coal production only dropped by 2%. So we're now in a system where it's just a question of how quickly we can build out renewables plus energy storage at a global level, and how quickly we can do that. So this shows you just a chart of how each of the major listed renewable players are building for growth, quite significant growth. A lot of this growth in solar module production is coming from the Far East. So most parts of this world, as you'll see on this slide, renewables are cheaper. than fossil fuels. We kind of led to believe that somehow fossil fuels are cheaper. That's not been the case for a number of years. And so we're winning this technology battle. And now it's just really a case of when and how quickly we can build this out, and whether we can solve the storage problem. So the markets have obviously realized something's going on, and the cost of capital, how much does it cost for a company at the project level to borrow before you can go ahead with a project? If you go back to even 10 years ago, the cost of capital for fossil fuels and renewables, it wasn't great for renewables, but as you can see over the last decade, the cost of capital for renewables, particularly offshore wind, and renewables on average has dropped, as you can see that yellow line along the bottom, whereas the cost of capital for LNG, liquefied natural gas, and for offshore oil and gas has just leapt. It's just become so expensive. This is Goldman Sachs numbers, a very strong headwind. But what does this all mean? And this is my sort of summary last couple of slides. Well, equity markets are very good at discounting the future. And there's some people that say, well, all this is going to happen very slowly. You don't need to worry. We can hold these companies. And as the market slowly moves, we'll move with the rest of the market. But in the real world, actually, by the time volume has declined, the share price has already dropped. And we saw this phenomenon with why Amazon's share price jumped way above Walmart, even though Amazon was only delivering 10% of what Walmart was delivering. And the same story with Tesla versus the rest of the motor car manufacturers, is because markets reward companies which are taking all the growth in demand, and they will penalize and derate companies which are the incumbents that are not taking any growth and have an inferior technology. We saw the same thing with Netflix and versus Blockbuster. Blockbuster had 80,000 employees, was in tens of thousands of cities. When Netflix arrived, we didn't say to Blockbuster, we're a long-term investor in Blockbuster, we're going to engage with Blockbuster. It was just a technology change. People sold Blockbuster and bought Netflix. Exactly the same thing is happening with coal, oil and gas and coal-fired power utilities all around the world, which is why all these oil and gas companies have been derated. There'll always be bumps along the way, as we've seen in the last 6 months with a supply sort of constraint, but that we've seen from Russia. But these are sort of bumps along the way to a complete, in my view, complete derating of the sector. So this one tells the story in a slightly different way. The incumbents expect growth. You saw my earlier slide that the companies are planning for growth, they're building for growth, and yet as incumbent sales fall, because the challenges, that blue line along the bottom, challenges start to take and displace traditional fossil fuels, you create what we call the stranded assets. The assets which will be built with a 30-year life will only have a 10-year life. That's really where the financial problems happen. And markets know this, and markets have reacted. And this shows how markets have performed since the launch of a report in 2011. On the left there, you've got the S&P 500, another proxy being the MSCI World Index, which many of you will use to benchmark your pension funds. There shows the performance of the World Coal Index and the Utilities Index and the Oil Services Index relative to the rest of the world. And the value of the energy sector has also fallen. Coal. Now, global coal demand peaked in 2013 and began to decline. But by the time global coal demand had only fallen by around 2.5% below its 2013 peak, share prices had lost 80–90%. This is the listed coal sector. There's a well-known British asset manager that said we will only engage, and they announced they were engaging with 40 coal companies. Within 5 years of their engagement strategy, they'd lost 80% of the value of their investments because they'd mistaken this as an ESG issue as opposed to a fundamental risk issue. And that's obviously an error to avoid. This shows you the performance of two portfolios, a low carbon intensity portfolio. This is from UBS and came out just the other month. And the red shows you what a low one would perform, how it's performed relative to a high carbon, which is the blue line along the bottom. So here's my sort of concluding slide. What I've been trying to explain is that markets are recognizing that there's a huge technology shift happening. The companies, fossil fuel companies, are being derated, not for any moral or legal or any other reason, but because they're losing to growth companies in the green technology space. And you've got these 5 stages of decline: hubris born of success, sort of denial of actually anything happening, the gasping for salvation, and then ultimately capitulation. And it's essentially the strategy that we're seeing for many of the fossil fuel companies, which are still stuck investing 95% of their balance sheet in traditional fossil fuels instead of really making this shift into a low carbon future. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mark. That was brilliant, as ever. I think when I listen to Mark speak on these issues, I think of, 2 things. I think of Ernest Hemingway was asked, how did he go bankrupt? He said in 2 ways, gradually and then suddenly. I think if we kind of keep that in mind for what could actually happen. And then in a real term sense, there was a report in the Financial Times in November of 2020 that looked at research that we had done with the Financial Times, and that the UK Public Pension Fund had lost £2 billion in its oil investments, because compared to 2017, the value of fossil fuel stocks went down terribly. I'll put that in the chat. I think there's just it's good to be aware of the wider case, as Mark has made, but also the kind of real case, as the FD story looks at, that has happened to LGPS funds. And there's a similar story with coal, in 2015. I think it's really, really good to be aware of. Roger, if you're ready now to speak on your experience, please go ahead.
I'm fine.
Thank you.
My name is Roger Evans. To give you a little bit about myself, I'm a councillor, and can councillors affect what we've just heard about? And my answer is yes. I'm on Shropshire Council. We are Shropshire Council, which is Conservative controlled, in May 2019 passed the emergency climate, and we agreed that. But it took officers until December 2020 to bring forward a strategy. A long time. In July 2020, we and the Greens and Labour were working together, which the opposition. We took a motion to council, and the council agreed to instruct the trustees of the pension fund to disinvest from fossil fuel. Is it risky? No. As was previously said about Mark Carney in December 2019, fossil fuel investment being stranded, and that interpretation is it's worth 0. In the motion, it says, is it a risk? No, it isn't. We gave the trustees of the pension fund 3 years, a 3-year time frame, in actually to come forward with a strategy where we were going to do it. Officers are fighting us. They want to maintain the status quo. They feel comfortable in what they're doing. We as councillors need to force the issue. I'm of an older age group, as you may well see. I've been around the block a few times. I've got children. I've got grandchildren. And what sort of world am I going to leave my grandchildren? What sort of world am I going to leave them when they are drawing their pensions? I want to leave them something that they can be proud of to do. We've had exempt briefings from advisors telling us, well, we could do better. Why not delay, maintain the status quo? We've all heard that before. If one goes back to the tobacco companies, they said they didn't cause cancer, and they had a big PR campaign. As is said by others, the oil companies have lots and pots of money. They will put PR campaigns and they will try to shake that tree and try to persuade us not to do. I think as councillors, And I want Lib Dems to be there at the front, not the Greens, not Labour. I want us to be at the front and to lead, because we've got our communities and we represent communities. We need to push, take the lead. If we look at cars as an example, 2 years ago, what was the future for electric cars? And suddenly it has changed, and companies have stepped up and they are doing what is needed. Shropshire Council invested £52 million in a shopping centre, which is now worth 17 million. Was that risky? Conservatives say no. If you look at recently in Parliament, and it's on Google press release, there's 132 councillors passed a motion or put a petition forward, which said that they want their pension fund to come out. And one of the paragraphs in it, if one looks at Google, and this is what they've said: it is recognised that as elected representatives, we have a responsibility to show leadership on the climate emergency and ensure that our pensions are not funding climate disaster. Let us get our house in order by aligning our pension investments with a green and prosperous zero carbon future that helps to contain global heating to below 1.5 degrees. Over 130 MPs, cross-party, SNP, Lib Dems, Labour, but only 2 Conservatives. We need to push the Conservatives. I'm in a Conservative controlled, and I see in the chat when it says that we are in a minority, I will lose the vote. So what? I will lose the vote, but I will go to the media and show what is being done. I will drive it to a vote and drive it to the media. And it's the media that will change it. If I can't get the Conservatives to change, I will work with them to actually do it. So as a councillor, yes, we can change, and we can change it for the better. That's what we do need to do. Fiduciary duty, yes, we have a fiduciary duty on the pensions, and I'm on the pension fund. But if we are going to get carbon zero by 2030, how much investment will BP and Shell have to make to actually keep their share price where it is now? I don't think they can afford to invest to get down to zero carbon. They can't buy companies, they can't do this. It's impossible for them to do it. We need to come out now. As is said, you lose money at the peak and you need to come out there. That's where we are at present. I can see BP, Shell, BlackRock and all the others, their values decreasing. We need to come out now while we can, and that will safeguard the pensions for the future. I am around to answer questions, but I think councillors do have a responsibility. We need to take this forward now, not in a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years time. We need to start taking action now, and we need to take it to our officers and tell them what we want. And if they won't, then we will shame them. That's what I aim to do. And as a last comment, with the code of conduct, of course, I have to say that is my feeling at present on the information I have, because I want to take part and I want to vote. I have not got a closed mind. I'm listening to the arguments, and that, as I understand it, is the only way that we have any chance at all of saving this world for my grandchildren. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Roger. That was kind of really empowering and great to kind of hear from your experience of leading to success, having success of leading to a vote, and also while up against opposition and the very persuasive techniques you've obviously used to get it this far. So we have a few questions in the chat, but please keep them coming. The first question is from Councillor Alison Holt. If you'd like to make the question, would you like to turn on your mic, Alison, and speak yourself? That would be ideal.
Yeah, sorry, just to find my thing. Yes, it was just that we are going through a process of the ESG and the pension scheme in Kingston, and we have as a result of our divestments, we haven't done it immediately. So I see it as a journey. Rather than divesting it completely, because it's actually quite a long process to do that. I'm a relatively new councillor, coming to the end of my first term, but it has taken a while to come up with the whole strategy and work through it, and start to divest. And you know, part of being a London borough, we're part of we can become part of the CIV, which we have done, and that's another pathway to it as well. But I'm not, and so for me, it's more. I just want to say it's more of the journey, and that we want to get there at some point, but we can't just do it right away. And I'm asking officers if they can actually project, you know, sort of show that journey in the document, so that it's an answer. So I suppose it's like, is that good enough? From what I'm saying is, you know, things that you've said tonight, I'm obviously listening to, but is that, do you see that as good enough, or is that not what you'd like us to see more, do more?
Mark or Roger, would you like to answer?
Roger, do you want to go first? I'm always happy to jump in.
I'll go first. And we've got an active fossil fuel group in Shropshire, and they ask public questions. And if I quote these from officers, and I say, it is a journey, but we need to make it quicker. And this is what some of the answers that the officers have given. The Pension Committee is currently embarked on an extensive programme of work to understand all aspects of its responsibilities and the options available to it for managing the risk of climate change. And to date, the committee have received a climate risk report. And then it also says, in answer to another question, the fund believes in seeking out the best available climate-related research in order to make its portfolio as robust as possible. Since Mercer's analysis identifies that the fund would perform better in a 2-degree centigrade scenario, that really, really echoes with me. We need to say to the officers, we want an investment which does not involve investment in fossil fuel. And I want them to produce how we can do it within 3 years. If we don't take radical approach, the world will not be there for our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Mark, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, no, I think I completely agree with Roger. I mean, the only thing I'd add is the companies, Glencore and the oil and gas companies, not just them, but many of the other fossil fuel producing companies have the view that their shareholders want them to carry on doing more. And the strategy that they need to hear back from investors is, hey guys, you've got to stop. The science tells us you've got to stop. We don't need it. We've got enough fossil fuels under development already to take us to 3 degrees. We certainly don't need them to be going to do any more. So typically they're spending $15 to $20 billion a year on finding and developing more oil and gas. These are the majors. So what Councillor Holt, whilst you're doing this important work, you as a group of trustees can ask the fund managers, whoever they may be, to send a very clear message that on behalf of the trustees and the beneficiaries of the scheme, they certainly do not want them to be investing shareholder funds, which might otherwise be paid out as dividends and share buybacks. They certainly don't want that money going and exploring anymore. That's a starting point whilst you're working on how to decarbonize and reduce the fossil fuel company exposure. But as Roger's, Councillor Evans said, you've really got to be having a 3-year pathway to get out. It does take time to sell a position. Everyone knows that. But some of these most liquid companies like Shell, you could sell in a day if you wanted to. You could sell in an hour if you wanted to. But you've got to have a program that lays out a pathway over the next 3 years.
That's great, Mark. Thank you. Thank you to Roger. Yeah, I think divestment used to normally be done over a scale of 3 to 5 years, but the Dutch pension giant ABP, which is 15 billion euro worth of fossil fuels, so more than the LGPS combined, I think they're going to divest by the end. Is it the end of 2022? It's something like incredibly fast. or by mid-2023, I can't remember, but it's basically the pace at which you can do this is kind of, it's not set in stone. I think Mark and Roger have made a very compelling case that we need to act now and act soon. So then I think the next question we will go to Christian Vassi. If you'd like to turn on your microphone and speak, please.
Thank you. I'm hoping you can hear me now. I'm going to be the agent provocateur in the room. All I've heard so far is what we shouldn't be doing. And I sit on a pension fund committee in North Yorkshire. We have assets of 5 billion. We're in a pool of around 40 billion. And as far as I'm concerned, hearing what we shouldn't be doing is utterly pointless. It's history. I sit on a committee with 8 Tory councillors, 1 independent, and me as a Lib Dem. In the past 15 months, we have transformed our strategy, but the transformation that is happening is driven entirely by what should we invest in. It's about solutions. Everyone knows on the committee I'm on, even though they're all 80-year-old Tories, that ESG is here to stay, that climate change has to be acted upon. We all know that. The challenge for a pension fund is we have a fiduciary responsibility. We have to invest in something. If we're going to pull it out of this fund, what do we put it in that will generate the change we want to see? And what I find in this 15 months that I've been working on is that we make progress when we identify better things to invest in. Simply rehearsing over and over again that oil is bad is history, I'm afraid. It's like, to me, summed up by the phrase, the Stone Age didn't end because they ran out of stones. Everything that Mark said earlier on, I agree with what you've said, Mark, and the writing's on the wall and everything has to change. But that's not the day-to-day challenge in a pension fund committee. The challenge is, where are the alpha funds? Where are the green infrastructure funds? How do you make a good decision that will get you green infrastructure and a 7% return? How do you get out of value-based equities that are all buried in fossil fuels and move to better funds? So my question is really, when will we start moving on from discussing over and over what is bad? Because we all agree here, and most people do beyond certainly in local government pension funds, I imagine. When will we really focus on how to create those things we can invest in as local government pension funds to move us forward, whether it's regional infrastructure or global infrastructure?
That's a very good point. That's a very good point, and you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And most 70 to 80% of funds are linked explicitly or implicitly to a benchmark, and your risk tolerance against that benchmark is often limited. You know, it's called tracking error, and you can diverge from the benchmark by 2 or 3%. Have you changed your performance? I'll just ask, have you changed your performance benchmarks? That's the first. Do you have a low carbon performance benchmark? And that would give the flexibility to the fund managers to diverge from what everyone else is doing. A lot of people say, oh, our consultants say we can't diverge from the benchmark. That's why we own Shell and BP and Exxon. And so you have to change. So I'm interested in whether you've done it or not. And if you have, you should be declaring it from the rooftops. The other is, have you had a public request for proposals for renewable energy funds? Because a lot of renewable energy fund providers that I know say that they approach local authority pension funds and the CIVs, and they don't have any big announcements or calls for proposals for renewable energy funds. And that's why there hasn't been a dramatic shift. There's lots of renewable energy funds raising money. They never get through to the investment committee because of one thing or another prevents them. So I'm interested in whether you've done a public, not a private one, a public call that says we're looking for funds, bring your best ideas to our consultants. And my first 20 years was in green finance. I was one of the builders of the green funds business at Jupiter and Henderson. And I switched to doing fossil fuels. I still do some green stuff because so much capital was tied up in fossil fuels. There was almost a stranglehold on the chance for renewables to succeed. But your core point, you're absolutely right. But how public have you been on changing your performance benchmark, your asset allocation, and another one, can you invest in private infrastructure like renewables? And have you announced publicly that you're looking to shift your capital into green solutions?
The challenge for local government pension funds, as I would see it, is that we're all wrapped up in pension pools now. And so we've got this big pressure to get everything through a pension pool. And the dynamic is, how do we, in our case, as one of 11 local authorities, exert pressure on the pension pool to come up with those products? We have in the past 12 months, we've now got a quarterly ESG dashboard that's coming to us. We have, as a pension fund, switched 10% of the fund away from equities towards infrastructure and are now actively looking for where we can put that money. We access opportunities through the pension pool. So there's a global alpha fund, I think we're going to be putting something like £500 or £600 million into, which is based around renewables and green infrastructure. Have we gone public? I'm not entirely sure I know what you mean there. So
I mean, it'd be a sort of very liberal thing to announce to the world of these important changes that you've made. I think that sounds very good.
Yeah, I think there are loads of examples of kind of reinvestment, both at the local government level, but also directly following from divestment. And I think we will happily share the kind of reports with you on that. Some of it's in the report we published in March. But I think sometimes, and I think whatever the case in North Yorkshire, it is maybe slightly further along than other places. We do often talk to councillors about this, and we are often at the level of, oh, BP and Shell are changing, and they're changing fast enough, and we do kind of see the need to make these arguments. Just in the interest of time, I think we're going to move on to the next question, just to kind of give everyone a chance. I believe Stuart Condy is next. If you'd like to turn off your mic, Stuart, and speak, that'd be great. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity. So I'm on the pension committee for West Sussex County Council, which is sounds like it's about the size of the Yorkshire one, which is it's about £4.5 billion. West Sussex County Council has also declared a climate emergency, and I've only been a councillor for a few months, but I kind of thought, well, this is a bit of a given. They declared an emergency, so surely, we can deal with divestment. So the answers I get back are, well, we've moved to ESG approach and ESG managers, and so we don't need to do any more, which, is, my reply is, well, you've gone half the way, why not finish the job, sort of thing. And then I get told, well, there's lots of technical reasons why this is very difficult to do, which I know is not true. I mean, I used to be chair of a pension fund myself, so I know exactly the problems about, there are problems with transitions, there are problems with, changing benchmarks. But my answer to that is, well, let's talk to the investment consultant and the fund managers and work out a way of doing this. I mean, there is going to be a way of doing this, and it won't take 3 years. Come on. it can be done in 6 to 12 months. I would have thought that's usually the time you allow for, when you're moving your investment strategy quite significantly. And this is probably quite a small change to, but I just get this, don't want to do it, don't want to do it, don't want to do it. And because we're a minority party, I just get frustrated. And then I start thinking, am I wasting my time here? And should I not really just go to the newspapers and fight it out there? So that's my question, really.
Thanks, Stuart. I think we know what Roger's view on that is. And I mean, the one thing I'd say is on ESG funds is a lot of them actually do have investments directly still in fossil fuel.
Yeah.
What the definition of ESG is open to anyone currently, really, and you could make that point. Roger or Mark, would you like to add anything to that?
It's not an uncommon story, unfortunately.
Yeah, following that, I'm the single Liberal Democrat on our pensions committee, but there is a Labour member from another unitary, Telford and the Wrekin to us, and we are working together. I'll propose, she'll second, she'll propose, I'll second. And we're working together to actually take it to the vote. The Conservatives outvote us every time, but we are shaming them to actually take action, and the officers are starting to listen because they can see where we are coming from, and we will not stop doing it. So yes, we lose the vote, but we are creating pressure, and I ensure that the media are aware of what we're doing, and at full council we will continue to do it. There does need to be an investment strategy. We do have a responsibility for getting that return for the pensioners, but really there are alternatives out there. And as has been said by Richmond and Wandsworth, I think in the chat function, that they've come forward and they paid Mercers to actually come forward with an alternative investment strategy, and that's what they are following. So it is possible. It's getting the financial advisors to actually look at it and get up and actually do some work and present what is an alternative.
That's great. Thank you, Roger. So next on our list is Stan Collins. Stan, if you'd like to turn on your microphone and speak when you're ready, that'd be great.
Right, yes, I'm ready. I'm on the Cumbria Pension Fund. I'm in the same pool as the previous speaker in North Yorkshire, but we do actually have individual voting rights for the shares that are held, and we are able to use that. And indeed, we used, although our holding was relatively small through one of the pools, we did in fact use it in May to help unseat 3 of the directors of Exxon. Yeah, it was only a very small part, but just when engagement is actually starting to work, I think it may not be the ideal time, it may not be the ideal time to get out. And it wasn't just that. There were 2 resolutions at the AGM which got through, forcing Exxon to basically reveal what it had been doing in anti-climate change campaigning and disinformation, which was again a very positive thing to have happen. As I say, we hold those shares as part of a pool, but not only, we don't hold them directly, they're all part of, all part of index trackers. And getting out of index trackers is really quite difficult. You can start hedging. Have they got any better ideas as to how we could get out of that? Because we need to have some vehicle for substantial investments. We can't just go and invest in a lot of very small companies. I'd like to see some of the mid-sized companies invested in more, but that's another question. So I think that we have an opportunity to work together as Liberal Democrats, and I do feel that we should actually start a group to coordinate our views on issues and to raise issues. In that way, if we work through our pensions committees or pensions investment subcommittees, which is quite often the case, by using our voting rights, I think we can have a big influence. We may also be able to influence the shaping of the products which the pools are producing, because they have to buy from us. Sorry, we have to buy from them, but they have to sell to us. They can't sell to anybody else. So we do have considerable influence, including having a director on the board of these.
Yeah,
we've got to use our, how can we get together to use our influence in a constructive way and really start moving things as they have already started.
I think that's a brilliant idea, Stan. Thanks. And I think Charles from the ALDC who's on the call would be very eager to help coordinate that group. We have everyone's email address, and we'll certainly give everyone the option to form a group, as you say. I think on the Exxon thing as a kind of successful example of engagement, and Mark, feel free to cut in here if you want, but I think having 3 non-executive directors on the board isn't necessarily going to change the core business model of a company, particularly not in the time in which we have to act. Like Exxon are much more further behind on progress than the likes of BP and Shell, which are already insufficient. And I think I'm sympathetic to the idea that if we had 100 years to get this right, or 50 years to get this right, we could have, you know, votes at AGMs that don't really go anywhere, or some, like, there are so few examples to point to, the vast majority of them lose. I think if we had the time to do this, that would be fine. But we're kind of short, you know, we can't keep holding out. But yeah, I'll definitely talk to Charles and we can coordinate a group. I think that's a brilliant idea, particularly, as you say, working across pools. In order to move things along, I think the next question, I'd like to ask Neil Ross to speak. Councillor Neil Ross, and please feel free to speak when you're ready.
Hi, thanks. Just trying to get my video working. Right, here we are. I'm in a slightly different position from everyone else. Yeah, I am on a pensions committee, but I'm in a Scottish local government pension scheme. We don't have problems with pooling arrangements. In fact, our investments are almost all managed internally by our own fund managers. Very little of it goes externally. But the pension fund has committed to the no new financing to companies that aren't aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. I think the no new finance point is very important, and it's a step towards the net zero objectives that we're all very keen on. And I think that the message from Lib Dems has to be one of pushing the transition to net zero and to zero carbon businesses and encouraging investment in that direction. So the positive side of this, rather than the negative divestment, which is taken by our Green councillor on our apolitical pensions committee. He would like to see us divest, sell everything tomorrow. And frankly, that doesn't align with our fiduciary duty. That's my problem, if you like.
Roger or Mark, would you like to take that?
Roger, do you want to go first?
Okay, yep, yeah. I think it's creating pressure. And I know I come from an English one, but if one looks in Google and looks at the petitions that are coming forward from the public, maybe driven by one sector, but if you look at it, there are petitions going on from Hackney, Somerset, Devon, East Sussex, Brighton and Hove, Surrey, Suffolk, Herefordshire, Wiltshire, Islington, Greenwich, Norfolk, Derbyshire, Brent, Newham. All those petitions are coming forward, and we need to get those. And yes, you can do it, and we will do it because we have got to do it.
Yeah, Councillor Ross, on the fiduciary question, I think my case I'm making is that the side has the case has switched. That was what I was trying to point out in my presentation, is that there's now a very compelling case not to hold a technology. At the end of the day, the internal combustion engine is a 200-year-old technology which is dying. When people talk about engaging, what are we doing? Engaging to keep a technology which is essentially going to be superfluous within a decade or so. And what fund managers should be doing is managing risk and avoiding risky companies. And the oil and gas companies are developing clearly a very risky strategy of more of the same. And so if we use the fiduciary duty argument, we would actually not be owning companies that are bent on destroying value for shareholders, as I see it, for the reasons I set out in my case. And finance officers often wish this magic wand of fiduciamus, you know, as if suddenly that closes down all discussion. And actually, if we think really about the fiduciary case, these are companies which are intent on destroying value for shareholders, and worsening the situation of the planet, and carrying on more the same. And the oil and gas companies in particular, if you look at their investment plans, which of course is what my 60, 70 staff do, most, if not all of them, are planning for more of the same, doubling production. And that can't really be in the interests of investors at all. So that's my view on the financial case. I completely agree with you that we need to be developing the green economy. And it's a real shame to me that British companies didn't do what Ørsted, which used to be called Dung Energy in Denmark, did, which was to close down their fossil fuel operations or get rid of them, and to go to a renewable strategy. I mean, the United Kingdom, we could have world-class leading engineering companies, but we just, for whatever reason, the shareholders didn't send that signal. And last time BP tried 20 years ago, remember Beyond Petroleum, the city didn't really like it. And the city didn't like it because trustees of pension funds, like we are, many of you here today, didn't send the signal loudly enough that they wanted the companies to fundamentally change. And I think part of tonight is about changing the message to investment managers in the city more generally about and as Roger has quite rightly said it, but the absolute speed, the necessity to move double quick on this one.
That's great, thank you both. Yeah, I'd also say on the fiduciary duty is LGPS legal advice and law commission guidance, I think from 2016, I'll put the links in the chat, so that fiduciary duty rules do allow pension funds to consider ethical factors and investment decisions, as long as they do not negatively affect the financial performance and are not contrary to members' wishes. I think we've been quite clear on the financial side. Members' wishes, they're up to you. And I think a really good argument against, oh, can we do this, can we not do this, is 6 LGPS schemes have divested from fossil fuels and face no legal or financial repercussions, which I think is pretty clear. I'll pop it in the chat, the 2 sources for that. And Andrew Elwood, you're next if you'd like to ask your question, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm speaking as a district councillor, so I'm obviously not directly relating to the county councils who have the pension funds. And I probably should know this, but what sort of relationship do the district councils have with the county pension funds? I mean, we could obviously put in a motion to full council to presumably suggest to the county council that they disinvest their funds from fossil fuels, which would be a good publicity move, but I'm not sure what else we can achieve as a district council. Thank you.
Roger, would you like to take that one?
Yep. I think it would be good if you did pass a motion. You can create pressure on it. Shropshire is a unitary authority, but there may be 100, 120 other organisations who actually also have employees as pensioners of the Shropshire Council. So as a Shropshire councillor, there are 4 Shropshire councillors and 3 from Telford and the Wrekin Council. We're there as trustees of it because we're the 2 unitaries, but I'm conscious that there are other organisations there, and pass a motion, take it up. There should be a public question time where you can ask questions. What is happening? Yeah, use it. Again, as I say, use the media to help it highlight what your council, your county council or unitary council is actually doing, and what you as a district council wishes it to be done. You are elected. You do represent the communities who put you there. Put that story to them. Tell them what you want. Create pressure on the advisors to the pension fund, the pension trustees who are the officers there, that there is a wish to do it and they should investigate alternative ways forward.
That's great, Roger, thank you. And I think now that we're at just over 6:30, I think that's quite a nice positive message to end on. I understand with divestment, I think sometimes we can present it as the easiest thing in the world, but actually it's a long, hard slog. But it has been done. Shropshire have done it. The 6 of the councils that have fully divested have done it. You can do it too. I think we've heard examples of, even in the face of opposition, it can be led by Lib Dems. You can work across party, and I think there is a renewed attention around this. There's a renewed interest in it. You go from passing the emergency climate declaration to maybe now looking a bit wider at what can be done, that kind of has a global significance on a local government level. I'll wrap up now. I'd just like to thank Mark and Roger again, and thank Charles. I'd like to ask Charles to speak after me. Or Charles, if you'd like to speak now, that'd be great. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah.
So-
Thanks, Ben, and thanks to everybody for your contributions tonight. It's been absolutely fantastic. Just say that I took away the note of the request for a Lib Dem group to kind of share best practice and coordinate and support each other on that. That's something that we'll go away look at if ALDC can coordinate that for all Lib Dem members and try and get that up and running and shared with people when we do follow-up emails to you all. Just say as well, I put some links to some ALDC campaign resources in the chat. We'll get those emailed out to you all as well if you want to use them for your local campaigning on this. And like Platform are here to support you with fighting for this issue within your areas. ALDC are as well. So we'll get our contact details to you. And if ever you need any sort of support or advice, ALDC will be here for you as well. But yeah, just on behalf of ALDC, just want to thank everybody for attending, everyone who took part. And yeah, thank you to Roger, to Mark, and to Ben as well. It's been a fantastic event, so thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks to everyone for coming. And yeah, we'll send out all the resources, all the recordings. And yeah, thanks to Mark and Roger for the very kind of inspiring and helpful messages.